Do you want to learn how to build perfect deck steps like this? Well, keep on watching. Let's get started.
We have a deck that's fully remodeled, however, the one thing that's missing is a stairwell, and that's where this video comes into play. To have the correct stair riser and run is a bit complicated, but is very easy if you follow these steps.
Now, one of the most important parts of any stair stringer project is actually determining what the overall height of the project itself is. I take a measurement off of that laser level at the very top of our deck and where our stringers are going to land. I take those two measurements, minus them out to each other, and that gives you the overall height between your landing and your deck. And then it's time for a calculator.
I want to make the math portion of this entire project as simple as humanly possible. So in order to do so, just type in stair calculator into Google and my carpentry will pop up at the top of the list. All you have to do is type in the total rise between the laser level that we just made, plus your targeted step height, your tread thickness, and your tread depth. Then press calculate and it automatically gives you all the measurements you need in order to provide the perfect consistent rise for each step all the way up to the deck. The key elements that help within this calculator are the stringer placement, the typical stringer height, as well as your first step height. But now that we have all this accounted for, let's get to lumber. For our stringers and for most stringers, you're going to be using 2x12 pressure treated material. In order to make this process as simple and straightforward as possible, I picked up these small stair guides or jigs and attached them to my carpenter square. I placed one at 11 inches and the other one is placed at 6 7/8, exactly the measurements noted in our calculator. While the jigs are pressed up against our lumber, I'm able to trace a line on both sides of our carpenter square, which gives us picture perfect steps all the way down our lumber, which will then be cut to the proper size. The first cut that I'm making here is going to be the side that's going to be pressed up against the framing of your deck. The second cut is actually the first tread that's going to be the highest tread on our stair stringers. With that side taken care of, I can move my efforts to the opposite side. In this side, I just remove any of the excess lumber that I don't need and flip the board over to cut that bottom side. The main thing we have to account for on this bottom section is the overall thickness of the riser. Because the fact that we're going to be applying a 1-inch thick piece of decking on top of this riser means that the riser itself has to be 1 inch smaller than the rest of them. That's why this riser is cut at 5 7/8 inch tall, while all the other risers are 6 7/8. This last cut that I'm making is going to be where the lumber is meeting the concrete. The main thing we have to think about here is just trying to get it at a 90-degree angle based off of where our stair riser is. But before we're able to position this stair stringer in the right location, I need to beef up our blocking and structural support for our stairwell. Because our deck joists are only 2x8, that doesn't give us much room to connect our stringer hardware to the framing that's already existing, which is why we're going to need to beef up all the structural blocking at this location. I install a couple extra 4x4 posts with concrete footings on either side of our stair stringer, and that's not only going to provide more structural support at this location, but it's also going to hold up our 2x8 bracing material that's going to be placed right below our joists. I install a galvanized L bracket on one side that also connects into our deck beam, but then also secure the other side with some galvanized nails. There's also a couple long lag screws that I attach to the back side to solidify this entire system together, and once that's fully installed, I can now determine exactly where our first stringer is going to be placed. This measurement that I'm placing is noted at 7 7/8 because I'm also having to burn an inch once decking is applied to the very top of our stringer. I make a mark on both sides, make sure that it's level, and as long as it's level, I can run a line all the way across connecting the two, and we can finally test out our stringer.
I'd say that looks pretty doggone good for the very first time fitting in there, and the way we can tell if it's right is if that thing is perfectly level, and it is. So we did something right. Perfectly flat over here, flat over there. Now, cut out the rest of the notches and do the same thing to 2 more stringers.
During this build, we did get hit with a nice torrential downpour, which is why I threw a lot of tools underneath my tent, as well as the fact that you can't see any of the lines on this lumber, but they are there based upon where I marked them earlier. Just know that I am cutting them with a circular saw, but I'm not going any further than where those two cuts meet. Once I'm done with the circular saw, I then bring over my reciprocating saw just to cut the small amount on both sides in order to have a nice 90-degree cut. I do this to every single section down the line, and we now have our first perfectly modeled stringer. With all that work being done on one stringer, the second and third stringers that we do are actually very simple and straightforward because all we're doing is tracing the exact measurements we already did. I cut out the stair treads and risers just as I did the first and did the same exact procedure with the third set. Once I have all three accounted for, I'm going to notch the bottom back section of each stringer, and this is because with these stringers we want to make sure we have proper support that holds these stringers in place onto the concrete, and this is going to come into play quite heavily once we get to that point. With all of our notches cut out, we can move on to bracketry. Now this is a galvanized adjustable stringer bracket that I'm going to be placing at the very bottom of the line that I previously made at 7 7/8. I then install 1.5 inch long galvanized nails with the help of my trusty palm nailer. We're only installing nails at the top section of this bracket, and once I have my first side done, I can then move on to the opposite side. Just make sure that that small little tail that's pointing directly at you is on the inside, not the outside of our stringers. And that's because once we place our stair stringers into position, it completely covers up that bracket and you don't see a thing because all of our hardware is going to be positioned on the inside of our framing. As for securing our stringers to our brackets, I'm using 1.5 inch long galvanized screws from Simpson's Strong Tie, and these are designed for pressure treated lumber and just gives you a little bit more structural support than your nails. With our two side stringers fully installed, I then position our 2x8 piece of pressure treated lumber that we slide into place underneath the notch that we previously cut. This not only aligns everything perfectly with a 3-foot wide span at the very bottom, but you're also able to easily shim up one side with composite shims, which in this case we did have to because the existing concrete slab was uneven. As you can see in real time, this was perfectly level, and I did check this all the way up on every single step, making sure that this alignment was perfect all the way across. With everything fastened down properly at the very top of our stairs, we can move our efforts to the very bottom with these large galvanized L brackets. Each one of these stringers will get at least one of these brackets, but the middle stringer actually gets 2 brackets because I want as much structural support there as possible, and you're never going to see those brackets because they're going to be hidden underneath decking. But before we get to decking, I want to make sure that this lumber lasts as long as humanly possible, which is why I'm applying a pressure treated solution to all the areas where I cut. And because our pressure treated lumber doesn't always have solution penetrated all the way through the lumber, we want to guarantee ourselves that we have a plentiful amount of pressure treated solution, especially on those horizontal surfaces, because those are going to be more prone to moisture. As I finally make my way to decking, this is a satisfying moment because the vast majority of all the hard work is already taken care of. The stair treads that we're going to be using for this project is just going to be made up of composite decking that matches the decking that we previously installed in our last video. As far as measuring and cutting goes, it doesn't get any simpler than this because all I'm doing is measuring 3 feet and cutting every single board to 3 feet exactly. Once all my boards are cut, I then move the pieces into position and start the installation process. Now depending on your rise over run pattern, it may look different than mine, but in this application, I planned accordingly and I'm able to center 1 board on the riser and 2 boards on the tread. Each one of these boards is 5.5 inches wide, and because we're going to be applying fascia to the sides of our stringers, you're never going to notice any of the gaps that are in between each section. A handy tip during this installation process is making sure you have a few helpful shims just to make sure you have a nice even seam at the very bottom as well as the very top of your riser, and then if you want exact spacing on every single tread, you can always bring in some deck-wise deck spacers. As I work my way down to the very last tread, I do realize that I probably should have anchored our bottom plate to the concrete before I started installing all of our treads and risers, but it doesn't hurt if you do it at this point either, and in order to do so, I grab an impact driver with a 1/2-inch concrete drill bit and drill straight through our base plate as well as our concrete. Just make sure you vacuum up as much of the concrete dust particles as possible before you get to your wedge anchors. Now these are 1/2-inch wedge anchors, which are designed for this type of application and are extremely strong. After I hammer it all the way down, I then take a ratchet and tighten it down as much as I possibly can. Then I move on to the other side, do the same exact process, and this base plate is not going to be moving anytime soon. Keep in mind that this base plate is not only here for structural purposes, but it also provides protection to your stringers due to moisture over a long-term span. In theory, it would be a lot easier to replace the base plate than this whole set of stringers at the very bottom. At some point during this installation process, I did realize that we do need some type of blocking for our railing that we're going to be installing at a later date. I cut a couple 4x4 blocks that fit in between our stringer sets and then nail them on each side. This structural element is very important when it comes to a railing, so please make sure you have some type of structural support for every single post location down your stairs. With our blocking in, I can then wrap up our last riser and move on to a little bit more blocking on the back side. You certainly don't have to do this step, but to stiffen up everything, I do like to place a little bit of added support on the back side of our stringers, and that will just strengthen this entire structure together and make your stairs less prone to squeaking long term. With that final framing element accounted for, we can move on to some fascia. This is 1/2-inch thick fascia material from TimberTech and it's 12 inches wide. I line up the top edge of our fascia with the very tips of our steps, and that guarantees that I have enough material to cover all the sides except for the very bottom of our stringers. Once everything is lined up, I install a couple screws to hold the fascia in place and trace a line on the back side. Once the line is traced, I then uninstall our screws and move on to cutting every single section out. My circular saw has an ultra fine blade on it, but I also give myself about a 1/4 inch of excess material in order to avoid going too deep into our fascia board, and you'll see how I clean this up momentarily. After I complete each cut, I then go back with a multi-tool just to cut that small section at the very center and then proceed to the next section. Once all sections are fully cut, I then trace this first fascia board onto our second side in order to avoid much of the double duty that we've already done. With a couple helpful love taps, our fascia board fits snugly into place, and I secure it down with Cortex fasteners, which are the same fasteners that I used for our treads. Once fully installed, you can now see that there's a slight amount of fascia sticking out, protruding past our risers and our treads. In order to have a perfectly flush and consistent look between the transition of our deck boards to our fascia board, we need to use a router with a flush trim bit. The reason why this works out so perfectly is that there's a small wheel at the very end of this router bit, and this glides against the existing surface that we're trying to route to, which in this case are our tread boards and our riser board. This may be a messy process, but it's extremely accurate and very smooth and easy to accomplish over this entire span. However, just be careful when doing this, and I am wearing quite a bit of PPE. I have eye protection, ear protection, and a mask on so I'm not breathing in any of these particles. At a certain point, I do try and collect some of these particles during the cutting process with a shop vac on hand pointed directly at the blade, however, it can only pick up so much. Plus, there is a couple areas that the router bit can't get to, like right up against our concrete, and in order to do that section, I do grab my multi-tool with a clean blade and cut off the remainder. It obviously doesn't provide as clean of a cut as possible compared to the router bit, but it still leaves a decent edge that can always be sanded down the road. I perform the same exact process to the opposite side, and once that side's taken care of, I can move on to the small minute section underneath our fascia board with more fascia board. Luckily for us, we did have some extra fascia board material left over from the fascia board that we installed on the deck, so these worked out perfectly in this application. And the real reason why these fasteners are my favorite fasteners are because they not only provide extreme hold strength because they're going to the dead center of the board, but they also come with these matching cap systems that you place right on the holes themselves, and it nearly makes each hole invisible. But with the caps in, we are now completely done with these amazing steps. We do have a railing obviously to install, which did turn out amazingly well as you can see, but that is a standalone video and that will be in my next video, so please stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you want to see that tutorial. But with that being said, we are 100% done with this beautiful, sexy beast of a staircase. Oh yeah,